entire sort of CV almost is read out, you feel like you've been around for a very long time. I'm delighted also to see so many friends, many of whom have been my colleagues of yesteryear, and some of you have been my very recent colleagues. Nabil Munir is here. He served at the UN as a very distinguished deputy permanent representative, and I'm very grateful to him because it's always good to see the foreign ministry also represented at such functions. It's important for you to also hear us in your new capacity. So let me start where Ambassador Aizaz wanted me to. He has spread out a very wide canvas, so I hope I can cover all of it. But whatever I can cover in the more formal presentation, perhaps what we can do is later take up in the question and answer session, whatever gets left over. So let me begin by offering of the international environment today, as this obviously impacts and has a bearing, a very close bearing on the working and the dynamics at the United Nations. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I only just got here, so I didn't have the time to prepare one, but the next time I can do that. I think most of you will agree that this is an unsettled time. We are in fact in the midst of a phase of unprecedented strategic uncertainty. There is little predictability in international affairs, and we are faced with an increasingly atomized international system. I mean, we can use different ways to describe it, but I think atomization is one of the ways that we can. So let me identify 8 features of the current global landscape, which I think are noteworthy. First, something that Aizaz also referred to, the challenges to an erosion of a rules-based international order, which is reflected in a number of developments. The renunciation of agreements that were previously arrived at, the rejection of treaties, again, previously arrived at, and the tendency by major powers to act unilaterally in defiance of established rules. This is happening in regions, and this is happening globally as well, including the trade wars that have been imposed. There are many other examples too. The withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, case in point, the rejection of the Iranian nuclear deal by a major power, the renunciation of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, and even withdrawal from multilateral bodies. These are all challenges to a rules-based international order. Second characteristic is the renewal of East-West tensions and the resurgence of competition between the major powers, which has been described by some as the advent of a new Cold War. This, of course, has also seen much closer collaboration between China and Russia, that only recently in the news headlines. Third, we see a weakening of the European project, which has been accelerated by Brexit, and this raises questions about the EU's future diplomatic weight. A great shame, because the EU has been such an ardent advocate and a supporter of multilateralism. Fourth feature, I would say, is the emergence of anti-globalization forces and the resort to protectionist policies that could further undermine and reverse aspects of globalization. I think all of globalization is hard to reverse, but certainly many aspects of globalization are in the process of some kind of reversal. The fifth important characteristic, I think, of the international environment is turmoil and the intensification of tensions amongst the major regional powers there. I don't need to spell this out, it's pretty obvious who I mean. And the sixth characteristic is that in a fluid global environment, there are efforts by the major powers to rewrite the rules of the game in their own regions through a series of unilateral actions. Again, I don't need to illustrate. In our own region, we've seen a unilateral action by our neighbor to the east. So this is something that is, part of a global trend as well. The seventh, again, self-evident, Asia as the principal driver of economic growth in the global economy. The eighth feature, I would say, is intensifying competition between major powers and others also in the area of advanced technologies. And in fact, this has become the new arena for competition between the big powers. The military uses of new technologies, for example, killer robots, autonomous weapon systems, these pose new challenges because there's nothing to regulate them. There's nothing to regulate their use. But at the same time, while new technologies are also creating economic disruption, for example, in the job markets, they're also creating new opportunities for economic and social progress. You know, technology is used in the future to regulate them if at all. And if I could add the last sort of ninth feature, it would be that in a global environment, which is in constant flux at the moment, what we see are networks or ad hoc coalitions becoming the preferred alignment of choice by countries. So in other words, formal alliances of the past are giving way to these ad hoc coalitions. Often there are single issue coalitions that come together on a certain issue and then they dissipate when that issue has been resolved. Now this of course is not an exhaustive list, but it does indicate how multilateralism is being to some of this and the way that it is affecting the state of play at the United Nations. As I'm trying to follow quite faithfully the way that you structured your thoughts and asked me, and we had no prior agreement amongst us. I think the most obvious illustration of these dynamics is to be found in the working of the Security Council, in its actions and more often in its inactions, its inability to act. It is more frequently deadlocked, it is regularly paralyzed, and when proceedings do take place, they often assume a very acrimonious tone. And often no agreement really emerges from there. And as you know, this is the premier body charged with the maintenance of international peace and security. So conflicts and disputes that need to be addressed are often or put in a state of continuous but incontinuous. As for example, the Middle East peace process, you know, the Arab-Israeli peace process, or the Yemen, or even tensions on the Korean Peninsula, which has been so high on the Security Council agenda and high on the global agenda as well. And compounding this state of affairs are, of course, what I referred to earlier, unilateral actions by global and regional powers in explicit violation of Security Council resolutions, and this further retards or hobbles any effort at peaceful settlement of these issues or these disputes. I think what we also see in the Security Council is counterterrorism issues becoming increasingly politicized. We see rising number of technical holds, and I will go into this later if you wish me to, because this is a very technical area. But under the UN sanctions regime, counterterrorism sanctions regime, countries are putting more frequently technical holds, and they're more frequently sort of rejecting the listing of certain terrorist entities or individuals because it is geopolitics that is influencing this whole area. Then, of course, other examples include the work of the First Committee, which, as you probably know, deals with disarmament issues. This has been in a state of, you know, describe it that way. Much progress because of the deep divisions and the disagreements in this, not unlike what's happening in the Conference on Development, the CD in Geneva. But the First Committee also, very little work, although the proceedings continue every year, but very little to, in terms of any kind of concrete outcomes. Also, we see that in the first and second committees of the United Nations, of the General Assembly, which deal with development and human rights respectively, we see that in the past, issues used to be decided by consensus. But now there are an increasing number of votes that are called on these issues. And again, this shows a division which produces this kind of outcome. Then we see polarization and intense agreement even on humanitarian issues. For example, the Global Compact on Refugees, which was adopted last year. It was agreed upon in 2015, very important global compact, which basically, obliges countries to follow certain rules, but it's not a treaty, it's not a formal treaty. It's just a set of principles that countries are supposed to adhere to. And this happened in the backdrop of all the refugees and the forced migration that was taking place in Europe. There were very, very chilling examples of people sinking in yachts. So, this was the backdrop against which some of this happened. And we had almost every country out of the 193 member states of the UN, except for the United States. So they agreed to it, but when the time, there were only 164 countries that signed up to it, or they adopted it rather. They had signed up to it earlier. Now, domestic politics in many of these European countries trumped their commitment to a multilateral arrangement, because it was, as I said, not a formal treaty or an agreement. So you can see that, much of the work of the UN is being affected by these, the headwinds of these global, these characteristics of the global environment, which fought the global environment. With that, let me turn to Pakistan and its engagement at the United Nations. And this, as I also mentioned, our engagement, in fact, only a month after our independence. And the independence of many countries, in fact, most countries in Africa, and some countries in Asia, we were able to play a key role in the decolonization process, which gave us early, if you like, an early strong voice, as well as, I would say, within the Committee of Nations at the United Nations. And over the years, Pakistan has been a very ardent advocate of multilateralism. And of course, we've always emphasized the primacy of the UN in international affairs. Engagement at the UN is extended to all three pillars of the United Nations: security, human rights, and development. Our engagement in the UN has involved both hard and soft power, what I like to call hard and soft power. Because in the realm of ideas, which is the realm of soft power, we've seen that personalities such as Dr. Mehboob Haq, contributed so much, which had so much far-reaching impact in the area of human development. The notion of index, he had a major role to play of that paradigm. Then we also had a Pakistani woman, Nafis Sadiq, who was the architect behind UNFPA, the UN's family planning agency, and another did UNSCAP only a few years ago. She stepped down, I think, 2 years ago. So you've seen that even in the realm of ideas, Pakistan has played a key role. In norm building at the UN, Pakistan again has played a role in contributing the ideas that have shaped many of the processes at the UN. Now, in terms of hard power, obviously this is more visible because it's hard power. Pakistan has for decades been amongst the world's top and most consistent contributor to UN peacekeeping. Our participation in US peacekeeping, spanning over 6 decades, I think is a tangible manifestation of the country's commitment to the maintenance of international peace and security. Since 1960, Pakistan has sent 200,000 troops, which have served in 46 missions in the world. Today, as I speak, 5,000 troops serving in 9 missions, mostly in Africa, under the UN's flag. 156 of our soldiers have paid the ultimate price for upholding peace and have embraced Shahadat or in the line of duty. As you know, we are the oldest UN missions in our country, which is UNMOGIP, or the UN Military Observer Group for India and Pakistan. And the role of UNMOGIP has become even more significant in the wake of August 5th, when India illegally annexed, occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So this is an important UN force that we've always supported, and we have been able to thwart a number of sinister efforts under Gibbs' budget over the years, which could feature. So this is something that PRs at the UN have been preoccupied with. I'm sure Azaz would remember from his own time there. Now, we've also been a leading voice in policy evolution in the area of peacekeeping. And one of the recent initiatives that we took there, I led that initiative, was to set up an informal group of top troop and police contributing countries, which we undertook as a joint venture with Morocco. And this has played a key role in discussing some of the issues which are important as peacekeeping begins to change, to reflect the changed environment. And this has been acknowledged by the Secretary General himself. He's often appreciated the role of the group that we set up. Now, Pakistan's engagement and standing in the UN is also reflected in other ways. It's reflected in the frequent election that Pakistan has won to key UN bodies. For example, we have served 7 times in the Security Council. This is not a modest achievement. This is a significant achievement because on the issue of occupied Kashmir to our priorities at the UN. Because obviously our priorities at the UN reflect and echo our national priorities and our core foreign policy goals, even as we engage across the spectrum on a range of global issues. But we are there to push our own goals and interests as well. And as Kashmir is Pakistan's core foreign policy priority, it of course remains front and center of our efforts and our engagement at the UN. It is, as you know, one of the oldest items on the UN Security Council agenda, along with Palestine. The agenda item is actually called the India-Pakistan question. And we refer to this agenda item whenever we address letters to the Council that we ask for circulation so that the Council is fully abreast of what is happening in our region. And of course, it is under this agenda item that we continue to call for a peaceful resolution of the dispute in accordance with Security Council resolutions, which we always argue is crucial for the maintenance of regional and global peace and security. In fact, in the wake of India's illegal August 5th action, which, as you know, forcibly annexed Kashmir, it was under this agenda item that with the help of China, we were able to ensure that the Security Council met to consult, to take up the issue of what was happening on the ground in occupied Jammu and Kashmir on August the 16th. This was the first time in 53 years that the Security Council explicitly took up the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. We have since then and earlier too kept the Council, the Secretary General and Secretariat briefed about the development of occupied Kashmir, urging the need for action by all of them. We've also regularly raised the issue during meetings of the Security Council, the General Assembly, under different agenda items, and of course the various committees of the General Assembly. The third committee is particularly important because this is the human rights committee that deals with human rights. And only recently, our annual resolution, the right of peoples to self-determination, was adopted by the committee. And this is a very firm and unanimous affirmation of a fundamental right by members of the international community. It was adopted by, I think, by the committee, we had over 80 co-sponsors for this, which shows the wide support that is enjoyed by this resolution. Of course, the lack of resolution of Kashmir, the non-implementation of not just one, but 11 specific resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir shapes public perceptions in our country about the role of the UN. This is obvious. It's inevitable. It shapes my perception, your perception, everyone's perception in our country. And questions are raised about the UN's utility. As said, is able to play a role that has been assigned to it by all the countries of the world. And this disenchantment or disappointment with the UN at the public level in our country, at the government level too, is not unique to Pakistan. I think what we are witnessing across the world is a growing wave of skepticism about the UN and whether it is fit for purpose, especially fit for purpose in a world that has changed so dramatically since the Second World War, which is when the UN and all the other multilateral arrangements were set up. And there is increasing disillusionment with not just the UN, but other multilateral institutions as well. Now, as far as the UN is concerned, much of this public disillusionment is directed or focused on the peace and security pillar of the United Nations. And that means the Security Council, because that is the premier body that deals with peace and security. I think as far as the humanitarian and the development functions of the UN are concerned, one, much less is known about them at the public level. And two, I think if more was known about them, it would establish the fact that the UN does very well in those areas. It is the peace and security area that is the contentious and the one that produces so much disappointment. So, you know, the Council is seen widely to have fallen short. Its failure to resolve long-standing disputes and ongoing crisis, and to implement its own resolutions, are seen as examples of persistent failure by the United Nations, by the Security Council. And this brings up what Ambassador Azaz also wanted me to address, which is the issue of Security Council reform, the process for Security Council reform, the negotiations for reform have been going on for the past 2.5 decades, with little agreement emerging on the fundamentals of such reform and with no solution in sight. And for this persisting impasse in negotiations is the gap in position between a handful of countries that seek permanent members for themselves and others, including Pakistan, led by Italy as coordinator of what is called the Uniting for Consensus group, which advocates elected members of the Council. So in other words, expansion of the Security Council by adding elected members and not by adding more permanent members as is advocated by the G4. But before I come to the G4, you know, one of the reasons there is so much traction to the position taken by Italy, Pakistan and other members of the UFC, people recognize the Council. It's not the elected members who are the source of paralysis. They're the ones who have the veto. The elected members and the non-permanent members who have the veto. And it is always the threat of the veto, often not exercised, but the threat of the veto, that then paralyzes the Council and stymies any progress on any issue, whatever the issue may be at hand. So the G4, which is of course India, Brazil, Germany and Japan, have been spearheading the move for expansion of the Council by adding more permanent members, essentially for themselves, to the democratic principle that defines our age. We have a long-standing position which is based on two fundamental principles. We want a council that is more representative of all member states, small, medium, large, and not one where privilege is the preserve of just a few. We do not believe in expanding the club of the privileged. Two, we feel that any reform effort should be consistent, as I said before, with the democratic spirit of our time. Thus, more elected members will make the Council more representative and inclusive, and also accountable to the larger membership, because accountability is only established by regular elections and rotation of members of the Council. Now, of course, to make the Council, to ensure that any reform succeeds of the Security Council, the position of permanent members is very important. The existing permanent members, for any kind of reform. Any increase in the Security Council membership would require an amendment to the UN Charter. And that's like an amendment to our national constitution. It is as serious and sober process. Countries don't amend their constitutions easily. And this is a constitution that determines, that member states, 193 member states have accepted as a constitution that governs them, along with the principles of the Charter. So amending the Charter is no easy business. It will require a resolution to be adopted with a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly, in the world, in our own region as well. And we see extreme intolerance taking hold again in our neighborhood. You can see that, graphic examples of that, chilling examples of that. Xenophobia is on the rise, Islamophobia is on the rise, and of course what we are also seeing is a record number of people who've been displaced in the world, either because of poverty or conflict or persecution. Now these are global problems, they are global challenges. We're also witnessing wide-ranging impunity, including for violations of international law, international humanitarian law as well. So there is, for reasons that I mentioned earlier, also the risk of new arms races. And of course, all kinds of competition inside space, which could also, people refer to this as new forms of warfare, which of course they are. But all of this is out there and is making our world much more fraught. Now, in this fraught environment, multilateralism is needed more than ever. In its simplest sense, what does it mean? I mean, multilateralism in its simplest sense is about acknowledging that we need global responses to global issues and global challenges. A retreat from multilateralism means that countries will take actions on their own with little regard for established rules or established norms. And it will also mean that exclusion will be practiced as a tool. And, we know that exclusion as a tool of governance doesn't work nationally any more than it can actually work in the long run internationally. So few of the challenges countries face in an interconnected world can be addressed by any country on its own, no matter how powerful that country may be. The nature of today's complex challenges cannot be met in isolation, separately from the rest of the world. And that urges the need to engage in positive sum games rather than act out of negative or zero-sum calculations. So given the need for international cooperation and solidarity to deal with the issues of our time, we feel, and I think Pakistan also feels, that multilateralism needs to be strengthened and defended, even if it has to be reformed and adapted. But we need global institutions, and we need the United Nations for all sorts of reasons. So let me close with a quote from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. He's very happy that I quoted him, who said at the recent Paris, I quote, "Multilateralism must not enter the future. Without the multilateral system and respect for international rules, we risk a return solely to power relations, reward sanction mechanisms, frozen conflicts," unquote. So we shouldn't sit back to watch an assault on multilateralism just when it is needed most. But as I said before also, multilateralism may need to adapt to a changed world in order to restore and renew people's faith in the value and the utility of multilateralism. And multilateralism not just on governments. I think that era also has passed. It has to involve the participation of civil society, of non-governmental organizations that do such stellar work, of young people, because young people are the future, and actually falling confidence in the UN is most dramatically illustrated amongst younger people across the world. Again, this is not just Pakistan, across the world. Young people seem to want to know, they want to know very little about the UN because they think it doesn't really do anything very significant. We need to address that rather than say, sorry, you don't know enough. The private sector also has to be involved in this new multilateralism, social academia, because ideas is what changed the world, and ideas are needed in a world that is beset by. With that, I will close. I hope I followed faithfully what was expected of me, but I look forward to your questions.